Chapter 54 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 54. Rumours of the prevailing disturbances had, by this time, begun to be pretty generally circulated through the towns and villages round London, and the tidings were everywhere received with that appetite for the marvellous and love of the terrible which have probably been among the natural characteristics of mankind since the creation of the world. These accounts, however, appeared to many persons at that day, as they would to us at the present, but that we know them to be matter of history, so monstrous and improbable, that a great number of those who were resident at a distance, and who were credulous enough on other points, were really unable to bring their minds to believe that such things could be, and rejected the intelligence they received on all hands as wholly fabulous and absurd. Mr Willet, not so much perhaps on account of his having argued and settled the matter with himself, as by reason of his constitutional obstinacy, was one of those who positively refused to entertain the current topic for a moment. On this very evening, and perhaps at the very time when Gashford kept his solitary watch, old John was so red in the face with perpetually shaking his head in contradiction of his three ancient cronies and pot companions, that he was quite a phenomenon to behold, and lighted up the maypole porch wherein they sat together like a monstrous carbuncle in a fairy tale. "Do you think, sir," said Mr Willet, looking hard at Solomon Daisy, for it was his custom in cases of personal altercation to fasten upon the smallest man in the party, "do you think, sir, that I'm a born fool?" "No, no, Johnny," returned Solomon, looking round upon the little circle of which he formed a part. "We all know better than that. You're no fool, Johnny. No, no." Mr Cobb and Mr Parkes shook their heads in unison, muttering, "No, no, Johnny, not you." But as such compliments had usually the effect of making Mr Willet rather more dogged than before, he surveyed them with a look of deep disdain, and returned for answer, "Then what do you mean by coming here and telling me that this evening you're a going to walk up to London together, you three, you, and have the evidence of your own senses? An't," said Mr Willet, putting his pipe in his mouth with an air of solemn disgust, "an't the evidence of my senses enough for you?"
"But we haven't got it, Johnny," pleaded Parkes humbly.
"You haven't got it, sir?" repeated Mr Willet, eyeing him from top to toe. "You haven't got it, sir? You have got it, sir. Don't I tell you that His Blessed Majesty, King George the Third, would no more stand a rioting and rollicking in his streets than he'd stand being crowed over by his own Parliament?"
"Yes, Johnny, but that's your sense, not your senses," said the adventurous Mr Parkes.
"How do you know?" retorted John with great dignity. "You're a contradicting pretty free, you are, sir. How do you know which it is? I'm not aware I ever told you, sir." Mr Parkes, finding himself in the position of having got into metaphysics without exactly seeing his way out of them, stammered forth an apology, and retreated from the argument. There then ensued a silence of some 10 minutes, or a quarter of an hour, at the expiration of which period Mr Willet was observed to rumble and shake with laughter, and presently remarked, in reference to his late adversary, that he hoped he had tackled him enough. Thereupon Messrs Cobb and Daisy laughed and nodded, and Parkes was looked upon as thoroughly and effectually put down. "Do you suppose, if all this was true, that Mr Haredale would be constantly away from home as he is?" said John, after another silence.
Do you think he wouldn't be afraid to leave his house with them two young women in it, and only a couple of men or so?' 'Ay, but then you know,' returned Solomon Daisy, 'his house is a goodish way out of London, and they do say that the rioters won't go more than 2 miles, or 3 at the farthest, off the stones. Besides, you know, some of the Catholic gentlefolks have actually sent trinkets and such like down here for safety. At least, so the story goes.' 'The story goes?' said Mr Willet, testily. 'Yes, sir. The story goes that you saw a ghost last March, but nobody believes it.' 'Well,' said Solomon, rising to divert the attention of his two friends, who tittered at this retort, 'believed or disbelieved, it's true; and true or not, if we mean to go to London, we must be going at once. So shake hands, Johnny, and good night.' 'I shall shake hands,' returned the landlord, putting his into his pockets, 'with no man as goes to London on such nonsensical errands.' The three cronies were therefore reduced to the necessity of shaking his elbows. Having performed that ceremony, and brought from the house their hats and sticks and greatcoats, they bade him good night and departed, promising to bring him on the morrow full and true accounts of the real state of the city, and if it were quiet, to give him the full merit of his victory. John Willet looked after them as they plodded along the road in the rich glow of a summer evening, and knocking the ashes out of his pipe, laughed inwardly at their folly until his sides were sore. When he had quite exhausted himself, which took some time, for he laughed as slowly as he thought and spoke, he sat himself comfortably with his back to the house, put his legs upon the bench, then his apron over his face, and fell sound asleep. How long he slept matters not, but it was for no brief space, for when he awoke the rich light had faded, the sombre hues of night were falling fast upon the landscape, and a few bright stars were already twinkling overhead. The birds were all at roost, the daisies on the green had closed their fairy hoods, the honeysuckle twining round the porch exhaled its perfume in a twofold degree, as though it lost its coyness at that silent time, and loved to shed its fragrance on the night. The ivy scarcely stirred its deep green leaves. How tranquil and how beautiful it was! Was there no sound in the air, besides the gentle rustling of the trees and the grasshopper's merry chirp? Hark! Something very faint and distant, not unlike the murmuring in a sea shell. Now it grew louder, fainter now, and now it altogether died away. Presently it came again, subsided, came once more, grew louder, fainter, swelled into a roar. It was on the road, and varied with its windings. All at once it burst into a distinct sound, the voices and the tramping feet of many men. It is questionable whether old John Willet, even then, would have thought of the rioters, but for the cries of his cook and housemaid, who ran screaming upstairs and locked themselves into one of the old garrets, shrieking dismally when they had done so, by way of rendering their place of refuge perfectly secret and secure. These two females did afterwards depone, that Mr Willet, in his consternation, uttered but one word, and called that up the stairs in a stentorian voice 6 distinct times. But as this word was a monosyllable, which, however inoffensive when applied to the quadruped it denotes, is highly reprehensible when used in connection with females of unimpeachable character, many persons were inclined to believe that the young women laboured under some hallucination caused by excessive fear, and that their ears deceived them. Be this as it may, John Willet, in whom the very uttermost extent of dull-headed perplexity supplied the place of courage, stationed himself in the porch, and waited for their coming up. Once it dimly occurred to him that there was a kind of door to the house, which had a lock and bolts, and at the same time some shadowy ideas of shutters to the lower windows flitted through his brain. But he stood stock still, looking down the road in the direction which the noise was rapidly advancing, and did not so much as take his hands out of his pockets. He had not to wait long. A dark mass, looming through a cloud of dust, soon became visible.